Why am I holding this up in my kitchen? This is kimchi, and it's now part of the dietary guidelines that came out last year. It comes out every 5 years. Major change is that they did include fermented foods and specifically mentioned kimchi as one of the fermented foods that is healthy for you. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Fermented foods and how that affects your health and what good bacteria are in these fermented foods. So let's go dive in right now. Kimchi, from smelly food to US policy. Who knew? Growing up eating this kimchi stuff every day was normal to us. But as you all know, it does have this funky smell. We're used to that smell, for us at least, but for the Western palate, it's way too strong. And believe it or not, it wasn't as popular by mainstream 10, 20 years ago. Since K-pop, K-drama's been popular, now everybody's talking about kimchi and how good it is and how good it's for you. In 2025, it has made it to the dietary guidelines for the United States. Just a little background, yes, I'm Korean, so eating kimchi is not something new. I've been doing it all my life. Growing up, kimchi wasn't really health food. It wasn't something you kind of thought about. It's like you're eating your foods that you grew up with. So for us, kimchi was food. It wasn't anything special. We didn't even know that it was good for us. And it was on the table most days. It fermented in the refrigerator, and the refrigerator did smell too. So my mom ended up putting used coffee grinds, and that minimized the smell. If you ever go to a Korean household, you'll see two refrigerators. Just like my parents, they have one that stores kimchi because it does make the whole refrigerator smell, and it may permeate into other foods. So you'll see one refrigerator dedicated for the fermented foods like kimchi and one that is for the Western food. And then when I became a nurse and realized, and suddenly the same food I grew up with was labeled too salty. And yes, we put a lot of salt when we make kimchi. And salt is equated with blood pressure. So it wasn't heart healthy. A food that sustained generations of Koreans was treated like something that we needed to avoid in Western healthcare. Here's the irony. As I said, the US Dietary Guidelines are starting to recognize fermented foods. And this is based on research year after year. The same category that kimchi has lived in for centuries. Not loudly, it wasn't announced, and there was no fanfare about it, but enough that made me stop and think, my gosh, kimchi is actually placed in the dietary guidelines? Who would have thought? Now, we spent decades calling this food a problem, and now policy is slowly catching up because of research. In the guideline, what's considered healthy food is deeply cultural for many of us. Kimchi didn't become unhealthy because it changed. The context changed. There's more knowledge about fermented foods and how it affects our health. In Western nutrition, which is focused heavily on isolated nutritions, such as proteins, there's also sodium thresholds and low-fat frameworks. And there's slowly some things are coming up about beef tallows and how good they are. And fermented foods didn't fit neatly into that model. So instead of asking, what does this food do as a whole food? The system asked, well, how much salt is in it? And when you reduce food to numbers, you miss what fermentation actually does and possible benefits that go along with fermentation. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans, which is published by the US Department of Health and Human Services and the US Department of Agriculture. These two organizations didn't say suddenly, well, eat kimchi, which that would have been kind of odd, right? What they did instead was more important. So those two organizations shifted from single nutrients to dietary patterns, which explicitly acknowledge cultural and traditional foods. And that is so important because that's how we eat generally, right? So recognize foods that contribute to gut health and diversity. They also softened blanket language around sodium when foods are nutrient dense. And that's how fermented foods entered the picture. Most people may not know this, but anytime there is a guideline like this published, they have to go through series of research and empirical data. And with that data, with the research outcomes, they develop new ways of introducing what's best for the Americans in terms of nutrition, diet, eating patterns as this new guidelines have come. So this kind of segues to the shift that wasn't from this arbitrary state. It really did come from data, and that's how these guidelines are published. That's their base. And one of the most influential studies was a randomized control trial published in a magazine called Cell. Participants who increased fermented food intake showed that they increased gut microbiome diversity. And diversity for your gut microbiota is important for a healthy gut. They also found that it decreased inflammatory markers, including IL-6. Now, this is all important because chronic inflammation underlies many chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disease, also linked to cognitive decline. And here's something caregivers that are out there need to hear. Microbiome diversity declines with age. So think about this. The populations most restricted from fermented foods may be the ones who benefit most from microbial exposure. So let's segue back to kimchi as one of the fermented foods. So kimchi in itself is not just fermented cabbage. It's a complex microbial ecosystem, same as in your gut. And studies have identified dominant bacteria, including Lactobacillus plantarum, Lactobacillus brevis. These strains are associated with improved glucose metabolism. Also reduce inflammation. They also enhance the gut barrier function. And Korean cohort studies have shown association between kimchi consumption and lower obesity prevalence. Also improved lipid profiles, reduced insulin resistance, helps with prediabetes. Most of this data is observational, not interventional. And let's break that down, what that means in terms of studies. So when we say observational, what we mean is that there's no intervention. They took a group of people who says they consume kimchi every day, whichever criteria fits the model for their research, and they would follow them, and then they have these outcomes they're going to measure. Then they take essentially a match of those people who are eating kimchi and the general public who may not be eating kimchi. And then they compare the outcomes. And that's what observational studies mean. Now, interventional studies, those take a little bit longer, a little bit more tweaking because you're introducing some kind of intervention and you're going to essentially break the two groups. One group having the intervention, the other group not having the intervention. So they would have something equivalent. So we can decide whether the intervention is what improved in the outcome. Most of this type of studies are considered observational because a lot of times you can't control for all these other variables. So it's difficult to do an interventional study. And that's why interventional studies tend to be higher in the hierarchy in terms of as a better research. This is why these guidelines don't single out kimchi specifically. But kimchi helped build a body of evidence showing fermented foods, important fermented foods, aren't just neutral, they're biologically active because they contain good bacteria. Because fermented food is in the guideline doesn't mean all fermented foods are equal or beneficial for you. So fermented food is not one thing. Different foods may contain different bacterial strains. They could be also fermented duration-wise. It could be for weeks, months, different live culture viability, what kind of bacteria live. Yogurt with Lactobacillus bulgaricus behaves differently than kimchi. Of course, these are different strains of bacteria. They may behave characteristically different. Pasteurization, like sucrose, doesn't act the same way as live fermented. Vinegar, pickled foods offer flavor, but not microbiomes. And live cultures aren't standardized. Right now, we lack long-term RCTs or randomized control trials comparing fermented food types head-to-head. So we don't know whether kimchi is better health-wise than other fermented foods. So instead of naming foods, the policy names patterns. That's being scientifically honest. Hence the term, what they use is fermented food. This shift matters, I think, more than people realize. What that means is that clinicians can discuss fermented foods without feeling off guideline. And also cultural foods stop being treated as automatically unhealthy. And nutrition counseling becomes more realistic and it becomes more human because we're accepting that people eat differently based on their culture. And for caregivers especially, food is often the last place of control. When illness takes over schedules, medications, appointments, food is still something families tend to share. And policy finally acknowledging that. And that's really powerful. So yes, for me, it's a bit ironic. Kimchi, a food that was once dismissed as smelly and strange, I was embarrassed to say I ate it, is now quietly influencing US dietary policy. Who knew? And not because it became trendy, not because of all the K-dramas, but because science caught up to tradition. Kimchi didn't change, but the system did. So in the next episode, we're gonna get very practical. We're gonna talk about which fermented foods actually contain live beneficial bacteria, which ones don't, and how to choose them, especially if you're managing blood pressure, diabetes, or some type of gut symptoms. Because fermented foods aren't magic, but they're also not weird. They're just food that we're finally learning how to understand.